Hello, good afternoon. It is 6 p.m. here on the Pacific Coast time. It's 8 p.m. in Chicago, where our guest, Lieutenant Colonel Singari, retired, is speaking. As you could probably see now, no, I am not Michael Young. I am not a cannibal hunter. However, I am the guest host for tonight. Michael is busy right now uh, making arrangements to jump talk, as we used to say in the military. So he's looking at continuing to move his operations farther afield to get as much information for everybody as he can. So in the meantime, while he's busy, we thought we would come in and help out a little bit with some information about the rapidly changing scene that's going on in the world right now. So again tonight, I am joined by Lieutenant Colonel Sargis Singari, who's in Chicago. So we're very happy to have him back tonight again. And it's going to be a little bit different tonight. So I'm going to be the Joan Rivers to Michael Young's Johnny Carson. So it's an informal conversation that we're going to have tonight. But during the course of tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the information operations that are going on out there with regards to the coronavirus, with regards to the CCP in the United States. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some legislative actions that are going on to address feeding the beast, so to speak, in the CCP. What's happening behind the scenes that most people aren't aware of. And then we'll talk a little bit about, we never want to take our eyes off the global picture. And then Colonel Singari will update us a little bit more on the Middle East, which those that follow the show understand is tied into China very much, via the mechanisms within the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, or the SCO. So again, a little bit different format tonight. We're very thankful that everybody's on with us, and we'd like to say thanks to Freddie in LA for being able to manage the control board, so I'm not confused punching buttons. I can just present information as it comes by. So to begin, what we'd like to do is, again, a little bit different format. It'll just be a quick presentation of information, but if anybody has questions, if you put it into the columns within either the Facebook or YouTube, after the program, we'll go through and answer those as best we can. So to begin with, I know everybody's been looking at some of the articles that have come out lately on Wuhan. So we had Secretary of State Pompeo mentioned that there's some information coming out about it potentially could have come from a laboratory, is one possibility. And so there is some information that might lead to, did it come from a virology lab? Is it leaked, from a virology lab in Wuhan? Or is it natural? And you'll see that the information that comes out against it is more, to me, more interesting sometimes than the actual allegation itself, because those that follow Michael Young know that how information is shaped is also a battlefield. The Chinese are particularly adept at being able to use it, and they have various mechanisms within the U.S. that use that information to their advantage sometimes. And it could be ideological affinity, it could be an economic benefit that they get. It could be this: the enemy of my enemy is a friend, and that's why they kind of follow the party line. But whatever their motivation, they typically will use similar tactics. And so we're going to do a quick talk to start the program off, looking at one of the articles from a few days ago. So I have a PowerPoint here from a recent article about Wuhan. So it's a little PowerPoint, and we're going to go through that. So a few days ago, so on May 2nd, Eileen Woodward, who writes for the Business Insider, she's a regular writer there, put out an interesting article. And you'll see a U.S. researcher who worked with the Wuhan Virology Lab gives 4 reasons why coronavirus leak would be extremely unlikely. So just to kind of educate Michael Young's fan, because you guys are a little above average on, noticing some of the information operations that are out there. You're going to see that the URL up at the top actually says why coronas did not leak from a Wuhan lab. So sometimes in the URL, they'll put catchphrases or keywords to attract people on search engines to that. And so in this case, the subtext is actually why it did not leak from a Wuhan lab, even though within her title, she says, would be extremely unlikely. And then if you go to the next slide, you'll see that Eileen Woodward is not new to this. She's actually written a number of articles before, including one on March 24th, where she actually says that the CCP's numbers are trustworthy. Now, anybody that's actually followed the trajectory of the virus in many countries will see that's definitely highly unlikely. So the fact that, that she was able to get numbers into the CCP that other governments and agencies haven't would beg the million-dollar question. Well, how did she get those numbers? By what is she validating them? But you can see that it's not quite her level of being able to screen information is somewhat in question. If you actually believe the CCP's numbers that they've been releasing on how many people were infected by the virus and how many people were killed by the virus, how many people went on ventilators, that begs credulity right there. So you can see that we already have a problem in at least her objectivity and perhaps her ability to be able to interpret data. And then we have to look at that. So we'll go to the next slide. So basically, she'll break it down. And in the article, you'll see, in this article, the reason we're doing is because it's gotten passed around. Probably some people in this audience have actually got this article themselves in a link or forwarded through email or in Facebook. It was interesting because we tested a couple of different accounts to see if Facebook would screen this because it didn't pass the smell test, so to speak. There was enough what they call fake news within it. It didn't hold up. But they didn't. They didn't screen it. They didn't flag it. They didn't say anything. So it was kind of interesting for us to see that it did pass through. But you'll see in this why those errors are there. So she presents right at the very top 4 reasons why she says that it did not come from there. It's highly unlikely. Number 1, she says it's a fringe theory that it leaked, came out, but there's no evidence of it. She also tries to quote a U.S. researcher who worked with a scientist at that Wuhan lab and said an accidental leak is extremely unlikely. Number 3, she says that the security lab itself has no record and therefore, it couldn't have happened. And then she says it's far more likely it came from nature, which, may be the case in that 4th one. But let's go through each of these really quick so we can kind of break down each of these and give you guys a little bit better idea about that. So the fringe theory, first off, in the first 3 words that she puts into the article, she calls it a fringe theory. So as everybody knows, most people know here, that's simply a pejorative contextualization. And it's used to basically try to steer people away from even looking at it. That's a fringe theory. That's a conspiracy theory. So don't even look at it. Don't even talk about it and that sort of thing. Another word that people like to use is debunked, right? And so at this stage in the game, it's way too early to call anything really a fringe theory. And it's interesting because if you follow the link, it's hyperlinked. She actually sources an article that's going to the British government, the British government intelligence services, which say that, yes, it is a possibility. And yes, they are looking at it. A number of other governments are also looking at the possibility that it did leak from a lab, mainly due to a lot of evidence, which we'll get into later. So her fringe theory is actually calling the US or the UK government's intelligence service a fringe organization, if you kind of read into it. So, calling it a fringe theory to move people away from, looking heavily at the facts is one technique that unfortunately she uses in there. And it's way too early to do it. Fringe theory is something that's fairly provable into the negative. And it's not based upon evidence, which, the lab theory actually has some grounds. It can't be proven at this point, but neither can it be disproven. So we have to look at it in that way. So next slide. She also says at the very end of that, there's no evidence of this. And so, it's either an absolute lie or she didn't do a lot of research. So, and this one, a lot of evidence is people that actually follow the story know that a lot of evidence actually comes from self-admission. So the Wuhan lab itself has released a lot of information about what they were doing. They were playing around with coronaviruses. They were doing what's called gain of function to try to naturally enhance some viruses. They were collecting viruses in the field and storing them. So there was a lot of that going on within the Wuhan lab itself, and there's a lot of evidence from the lab in its own language. There's also French organizations and people that were building that lab. They were working with the people in the Wuhan virus lab, and they've also said that there was a lot of problems with the lab itself as far as safety protocols. And the famous one, of course, now is the U.S. State Department papers have come out that shows that, last year that there was actually a problem that was observed by the State Department or by U.S. teams that were there that said, hey, this is a problem that we need to be careful of. And they were asking for help. So that basically, you look at it, you have multiple sources and a multiplicity of supporting evidence. And for her to say that there's no evidence of this is, like I said, either an absolute lie because she's trying to conceal that, or her research skills are somewhat lacking because the evidence is definitely out there. And again, multiple sources from government, non-government, from the Wuhan lab itself, and a multiplicity of supporting evidence. So next slide. And then she goes into, this is probably the most, the second to the next ironic one. So one U.S. researcher who has worked with scientists at the Wuhan lab explained to Business Insider why an accidental lab leak is extremely unlikely. Her words, her bullet point. However, if you'll notice, what it says is she worked with scientists at the Wuhan lab. She was never actually at the lab, which the article does go into, but it's a little misleading in the bullet point. It kind of leads you to believe, if you read it quickly, that, oh, there's somebody was at the lab and there's no way it could have come out. It's extremely unlikely. The person that they quoted was never actually at the lab. She just worked with scientists from the lab. The other part is that these virus labs are actually very unsafe. There is a history of leakages from labs. So we look at SARS. Everybody remembers 2002 and SARS. Well, guess what? That was leaked from a Chinese lab. The World Health Organization, before they became kind of beholden to the Chinese party, admitted back in 2003, 2004 that yes, twice that SARS did leak from a lab in China. So it is not unknown. Even in America, next slide, you're going to see that you've got these leaks that come from the labs. So next slide. And so much so that for 3 years, the United States actually banned what's called gain of function. And this is where our guest will actually be able to talk a little bit more about this after this. The gain of function is a natural process by which you can enhance viruses. So you pass it from one animal to the next, replicating, speeding up kind of that natural evolutionary process of a virus jumping from one host to the next in order to try to manipulate it into gaining certain functions from each of those hosts. But in some research, the models were a 20% chance of a very catastrophic pandemic outbreak from a lab, and that is in the US. And because of that probability, it was about a 20% probability in some high estimates, the United States actually put a moratorium on it. They banned gain of function in the US for about 3 years. And that's very important because until these very, very strict protocols were put in place actually a couple of years ago, they had banned it. And so, again, leaks were very potential in this case. And so China did not have those from the accounts that we have from the French. They actually did a lot of shortcuts. So even in the US, it was a concern. How much more so could it possibly be in China? So the potential does exist. And so to close that potential off is extremely, I would say, irresponsible of the writer. So next slide. Mm. And again, even in the US, you could just go back a few years, 2014, 75 scientists, US Center for Disease Control actually came in touch with anthrax. Smallpox was moved about. So we have a lot of history of these lab leaks going on. Next slide. Next slide. And next slide. And again, feel free to do your own research on this. You can see that the gain of function and what that means and what that entails. So next slide. Now, this is where the two kind of combine in there. So she quotes a US researcher named by Joni Mazette. And she says that, she worked with some people that worked with the lab, and it's extremely unlikely. Well, number one, it's a little irresponsible of the researcher as well, because the United States actually banned that very same testing that that lab was doing in order to put a 3-year research project in place to put these large protocols, these safety protocols for our labs. And that didn't occur there. So for her to say it's extremely unlikely, a 20% chance of a catastrophic pandemic outbreak is not extremely unlikely. I don't like those odds. If you had to go forward and disarm a bomb, and it's 20% chance that you're going to blow up Manhattan, that's not extremely unlikely. That is a potential you want to be able to mitigate. And so we have a little bit of a responsibility there as well. Does she have a potential bias? Yes, because her job, and she gets money for going into Thailand and into China and looking for pathogens in the wild, looking for viruses in the wild and collecting it. So if the lab is found to be the source of the outbreak, there's not going to be as much focus or money that goes into trying to get it. There'll be some in there, but there's a lot of different motives. We'll go into that another time, but I want to go forward here. But just recognize that her source that she uses does have a little bit of a bias and does have a little bit of a background to her, which would say lead her away from that lab explanation. Next slide. And this is probably the funny one. And Sargis, you're going to laugh at this one. This is hilarious. And everybody's watching the show is going to laugh. So the high security lab says itself, it has no record of the novel coronavirus genome and follows strict safety measures. So the very people that potentially are under the microscope says, oh no, we don't have any record of it. And we follow strict security measures in the CCP. Next slide. So those people that remember, Schultz, I see nothing, I know nothing. This is not really, it's asking the fox in the hen house, hey, did you steal any chickens? No, I didn't steal any chickens. So there has to be an independent verification. Next slide. So without independent verification, how in the world are you able to get that information, right? Because in other words, how did this reporter, Eileen Woodward over at Business Insider, get access to the records and or to verify them? Do you do your due diligence, your forensics in that laboratory to do that? I mean, weapons non-proliferation teams, all sorts of outbreak intelligence teams, all this sort of thing that takes time, and it takes being on the ground and be able to have access, unfettered access to information, to records, to people, and interview them. And that hasn't happened in Wuhan. So just taking people at their face value, especially if they have some stake in the matter, is not very responsible. So next slide. And again, Sargis will be able to talk about this a little bit more. A good case of this is 1979 in Russia, where you had Biopeporat, which was the largest bioweapons program in the world in history. And they pretty much had an outbreak in 79. And for years, they had pretty much convinced everyone, including many foreigners, that, yep, it was not accidental. It was natural. It came from a natural cause. So there is a historical precedent, not just in normal outbreaks, but in covering it up and being able to mask evidence. So next slide. And again, just taking the CCP at their word, she did it for their numbers on the deaths and on the infection rates, which everybody can see is pretty far-fetched. The fact that she takes it in this, again, not very responsible. Next slide. And the next slide. Now, again, her final point was it came from bats. Could be in nature. Absolutely. It may have jumped from animals. We don't know. So again, quick review of this, and we'll get jumping right in with our guest. So she goes over the 4. So let's look at it real quick. No evidence, right? One researcher says it's unlikely, but the CCP lab said far more likely it jumped. How does that rack up? Next slide. Number 1, no evidence. Go for it. Next slide. Absolutely debunked. There's lots of evidence out there. If you look at the Chinese language sources especially are probably some of the best. So what Wuhan admitted to itself prior to the outbreak, it definitely shows that they were playing around with some items that were pretty bad. Evidence of lab leaks are all out there. If you look at 2014, 2002, 2003 SARS, it's out there. So no evidence, that's not true. Next slide. What do we say about one researcher says it's unlikely? Next slide. Well, absolutely not. Is there a potential bias, conflict of interest? Yeah. She wasn't actually at the lab, so okay, well, what basis do you have? And she ignores multiple sources from the labs that actually contradict that. That shows, yep, lab breaks are a potential. So next slide. I don't even want to get into this. This is self-evident. Nobody needs to, if you listen to the CCP, you've already pretty much lost your article. Next slide. And next slide. And far more likely to jump. Next slide. Yep, probably so. It's definitely a potential cause, but it's not the only one. So you'll see a lot of articles like that. And go ahead, next slide. Let's close it out. So that's the quick and dirty analysis of a article. So you'll see that in the Business Insider, but that helps you evaluate it. So look at the writer, look at the background of the writer, what other articles did they do, who owns the Business Insider, look that sort of thing up. But that's kind of a quick and dirty about what article that's going around, and to see that. The other thing you'll look at is there's a lot of organizations and news articles that are very geared toward trying to divert you away from that as a possibility. They can say it's an unlikely event, maybe it happens, but since January 28th, I know that they have talked about, every time that this comes up, and Senator Tom Cotton was actually the first person to bring it up based on some information that he had seen. From the get-go, everybody was saying it's debunked, it's already out there. Well, until you have the evidence, you can't debunk it. So you have to either prove or disprove it based on evidence, not based on opinion. So is it a possibility? Yep. Has it been proven? No. But we have to keep it open. So I now want to go to the guest, Sarga Singari. So I know back in February, you were researching this, looking at it. So first off, I want to thank you for coming back here, especially just talking to me and not Michael. So I guess you must be lonely tonight or something. So I definitely thanks for coming on. So I definitely appreciate it.
No, it's good to be here, Al. Always a pleasure. And as everybody's listening to this interview, they know that now that Al is the brains and I'm just here because of my looks. Reality is that the way you laid it out is outstanding. I always say to most individuals who are part of the reporting process, do not become suckers for information operations, because you'll get played. It's not a matter of how many likes you get or how many shares you get on your particular medium. You got to be doing your due diligence. As you know, multiple times, Al, when we've written articles, I've written articles in the Near East, I've taken my time before it was published. I've even had major newspapers who have gotten to me when we were in Iraq and Syria fighting with the Syrian armed forces, saying, hey, you guys got the intel on the ground. We're about to go live with your information. You'll break the news first. And I said, no, hold off, because I don't know where the U.S. wants to be when it comes to decision-making process as to who's going to take the credit for this particular fight. So in that capacity, even under the previous administration, me being a Republican, I still wanted to make sure that we did our due diligence to ensure that the U.S. wasn't embarrassed or put in a bad position. And in this case, I think my recommendation to all these writers is take your time. Look, as you mentioned, our article that initially I had written in February, first part, initially sent it out on 24th February. To a local newspaper for them to look at for publishing. I even pulled it back at one time and said, let me make sure I verify some intelligence. And then, of course, we went to Japan Forward almost a month and a half later before it was published, and we're still ahead of the curve before anybody else was talking about what was happening within the Wuhan lab. Now, I own the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement. I'm the CEO. If it was just about me, I could have easily published it. I probably would have published it in January. At that time, we were in the primary. I'm running for U.S. Congress in the 9th Congressional District of Illinois. There's a lot of money at that time that we could have collected for our campaign. I could have been on major news radio networks talking about the story that I broke that nobody else was talking about until a month and a half later. But it's not about just Colonel Singari. It's not just about me, my particular article, or what I want to achieve as far as for my personal goals. And I tell our journalists it's about the United States, what the United States presence is going to be, how it's going to be received. And sometimes I take articles as an independent writer, and instead of publishing myself in my own particular site, which is the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement, and I put it out in other mediums that are a little bit more critical, where they push back with their editors, say, well, I don't know if I'm going to carry this. What about this? How about, questioning you on issues that are very important, to make sure that when an article comes out, it has gone through multiple viewpoints. And at the same time, it's not just being written through your own echo chamber, because when I set up the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement, it was set up to show how governments actually talk to each other, what we call link analysis through open media sources. And in this case, we know that the Chinese government uses information operations as a modem to be able to influence U.S. Policy, especially within the U.S. consumer itself, to ensure that we do not get in this way as it's trying to expand globally, both economically and military-wise. So that would be my only advice to reporters, that don't get suckered into being used by others. And in this case, I think it's unfortunate that there's no safety mechanism, in this case for the Business Insider, to be able to have gotten out of their own echo chamber and kind of looked at, hey, what are the possibilities here? So that would be my main advice on it.
That's pretty good. Now, when you were doing research for that article earlier, I know it was in February and that sort of thing. How many times did you have to go back, and how many times did you verify that information? And I know you went through a lot of processes. You reached out to me a number of times. How long did it take you from kind of soup to nuts to get that thing published?
Look, I went through probably 12 iterations of it. I had a number of editors look at it. And again, like I said, I could have gone live, and I know there was some frustration because everybody's like, get it out, get it out, get it out right now, because you'll be the hottest thing on station. But it's not about that. It's about making sure you do it in a way where it's long enduring. So what I've written right now is long enduring, and you could put my article against any other article possible. We all knew that in both Wuhan and Sverdlovsk, which you mentioned, which is a city in the former Soviet Union, where in 1979, as I was saying on your slide, there was an accidental release of deadly anthrax spores from a Soviet military research facility in the city. And in both of these cases, we realized that the communist government blamed the outbreak on consumption of illegal or exotic animal meat obtained from illegal and unlicensed markets. I also looked at both in Wuhan and Sverdlovsk authorities in charge at the time of dealing with the situation. As they always do, blame the victims for spreading the outbreak, shifting the responsibility away from the government agencies and leaders on the innocent people. And in both cases, the communist government prevented accurate information from being released, and denied access to international experts who could have at that time probably saved a lot of the local populace if they had gone in there swiftly. So you have to understand the background of what these governments are You have to know that. That's why, we, and from the last discussion I had with Mike in 2015, you and me, Mike, were on stage in Tokyo, Japan, talking about the fact that, this is what the Chinese are doing when it comes to their information operations. So if you know the basis of the enemy, as we were taught in the military, you're able to really bounce off a lot of your decisions as to what are you going to write, how are you going to write it, how you want to present this. And I think a lot of the time in the context of historical concepts that we guide off of, it's easier for us to be able to inform our readers. Because what I write, at the end of the day, is to start a conversation. Even when we had talked about whether or not the Wuhan virus, as you were mentioning in your opening comments, or the Chinese Communist Party virus is a bioweapon. Look, China's lack of transparency about the coronavirus outbreak has really raised suspicions that the COVID-19 was developed, at least in some ways, as I stated, related to poor processes in the P4 lab, biological research facility that is located in the city of Wuhan. I always say to writers that, as you're looking at it, don't ever speak in indefinites. You're not a state apparatus. You're not the country itself, so you're not going to know what our intelligence agencies know. And even if you do know, even if when I had intelligence guys on the ground in 43 different countries with the Australian Army operating, collecting intel, there's some things you just don't share, as you know yourselves. There's some things that you and me are always going to take to our graves without anybody ever knowing, because that's part of the process, because it's the focal point of where the U.S. has to be in the strategic fight over decades, not where your article is going to be and how many likes it's going to get. And as you know, when you do a bad job of making sure you do your due diligence, you could have a guy like Al sit there and absolutely destroy it. So look, with that said, we should note that that the circumstantial evidence is that we're tying the Wuhan coronavirus outbreak to where the PO virology lab has grown ever since I wrote that article. And you mentioned those examples that scientists working for the People's Liberation Army and the Wuhan Institute of Virology published articles, both, as you have mentioned in the past, in 2005, Science magazine, and in Nature in 2013. That clearly stated the goals of the lab. So this is something, as a researcher, as a journalist, you need to look at. These are their examples. This is what they talk about, which was to replicate the bat's ability to asymmetrically carry a virus. So the coronaviruses were used in these experiments. Senator Cotton, as you mentioned him in January, referenced an epidemiologist who stated these issues, that the virus went into the seafood market before it came out of the seafood market, and then immediately followed it up by making comments, descriptions on the procedures in the P4 lab, and as far as operations in Wuhan and those labs. And he also referenced a Lancet article stating that the patient zero had not been infected in the seafood market. So, these are intelligence folks. These are major newspapers, major journals that are highly respected that are writing about this. I'm not a scientist, so I go to where these things have been published. Wuhan, as you said, was not the only location where the Chinese government was conducting these type of experiments with possible pandemic consequences. They're the Chinese, they do these things. As an example, as you mentioned, there were also 4 facilities after the SARS leak from a lab in Beijing, or I should say 4 casualties, not 4 facilities in 2004. And in December 2019, it was where in Lanzhou, China, 65 lab workers were infected with bursitis, which was a bacterial infection that spread from animals to people. So, when you look at all these aspects, we know also that in this case, the Republic of China was conducting virology experiments on bats in 2 of those labs in Wuhan, not just one. And in February of 2020,
I want to be clear, it's the
go
People's.
ahead, buddy.
Yeah, I want to be clear, it's the People's Republic of China. So Republic of China being Taiwan, so People's Republic of China. So I want to be
Yes,
clear
I
about that.
apologize. Yes, People's Republic of
There's
China.
the
Thanks
good
for the
guys and the
correction.
bad guys. So yeah, we don't want to like
I told you
accuse the good
that.
guys doing bad stuff.
Yeah, that's why we have, like I said, that's why Al is here. Look, and I think we were going back in in the February of 2020, Shan Wei, Chinese top bioweapon military expert, was appointed to take control of the Wuhan lab, where he has been reported that the coronavirus originated from. So, look, all these issues are what raises a suspicion that the Wuhan global pandemic is a man-made crisis, not one of natural making. Look, uh, I want to go back to this question that's, I think, where the fight is constantly, where we continuously say that, well, this coronavirus is natural and appearing in nature. Yes, it is. We know that, but science has been doing experiments on it. And the only thing I could tell folks, I think the way it makes sense, Americans being dog lovers, I tell them, look, it's a chihuahua, a naturally occurring creature. And people say, yes, he is. Okay, or you can have two chihuahuas out there that can mate and it could create more chihuahuas. But that dog was bred into existence, just like a German Shepherd was bred into existence, just like any other type of dog that we have in our houses today that we're looking at as we're having this discussion was bred. So when you say it's naturally occurring, it's bypassing the fact that there was an intent by individuals to breed this animal and created it. And as we know, and as you know, Al, these virology labs are used for biochemical usage, and I think the Chinese were very much interested in knowing how is it possible that a bat can carry a virus without it being detected. And if I wanted to create, if I'm a bad guy, let's say I want to create a bioweapon, I'm going to try to use that as an example to see how I can introduce somebody into any army that is competing against me, or any state apparatus, their governments, to see how I could maybe inject a virus into those leadership, into that community, by making sure that the detection systems that we have out there today cannot detect it. It's just part of the human nature when it comes to how the Chinese
Right.
Communist Party operates.
Well, yeah, and I think it goes back to something that's I think omitted in a lot of these conversations and a lot of the attempts to deflect away from this. So even if we assume, and you're absolutely right, that this you can make a biological agent that looks very natural, that occurs in nature, and you harvest it. I mean, that's what anthrax is. You weaponize anthrax in many different ways to make it more viable, but it comes from nature. But again, the dual use nature of this technology is being overlooked in all of this. And there's a big thing that gets overlooked is the non-proliferation. So we know, as you mentioned before, that the CCP is aligned through the SEO mechanisms with some bad actors. Iran, which is the largest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. Hezbollah and those other satellite organizations from Iran, they sponsor some very bad guys that do very bad things. And so and we know that there's a partnership between China and between Iran. We know we've caught them with the hands in the cookie jar before, when China was moving some prescribed weapon of mass destruction materials to Iran, and that's public record. So that was in the 90s. We know that they've done that before. They've skirted international non-proliferation treaties in order to proliferate some very bad weapons to some very bad people. Now, have they suddenly had an epistemological moment and have changed? I don't know. But the mechanisms are in place for a reason, right? Because even if the state doesn't say they don't want to sell it, Xi has a moment of kindness and he says, I'm not going to hurt the world anymore. There could still be someone, if you don't have these mechanisms in place and you're not transparent, you're not sharing information with partners, in mitigating the transfer of these potentially dual use technologies. And in this case, the biological weapons potential from innocuous biological research is great. You can steal it from labs. You can take it from labs. You can, as you can roll over a scientist that's working. He's bankrupt. You catch him in a honey trap operation. You can put the squeeze on him, and he can bring you a vial out of the lab, right? So it doesn't even have to be a state mechanism. But if the state doesn't have control, if the state isn't invested in transparency and in buying into the international framework of cooperation to make sure that non-proliferation happens, you have a potential whereby something that was built for peaceful purposes can be used for very dangerous purposes. And we see that again and again. And unfortunately, what the CCP has proven in this last one is that even on something very basic, like a pandemic outbreak, which you think would be the height of cooperation in the world, right? If it was a natural outbreak, why in the world are you hiding it? Why in the world did you go through so much trouble for so many weeks to hide all of the evidence, to deny, to obfuscate, to cloud the issue, to go out of your way to do, things which are absolutely unnatural. I mean, you went to the Lunar New Year, they had, huge crowds, they exacerbated this thing. Why in the world would you do that? I mean, even that shows irresponsibility. It's like a person. If you look at them and they're irresponsible with something that should be very simple, straightforward. Here's a pandemic. If you honestly believed it was natural, then you should have done everything you could in the mechanisms that are already built through the World Health Organizations, the UN, and international partnerships to get control of this thing, but you didn't. How in the world are we to trust you with anything else, anything beyond that? How are we to trust you with nuclear weapons? How are we to trust you with any more biological research going forward from here? Because even if this doesn't come from a lab, their very actions about this pandemic from day one have shown that they're irresponsible. So let's say the 20% happens in that Wuhan lab and something else gets out of there. They're not capable of being able to use those international frameworks to protect the world. And that's the question that's getting, I think, not asked in this whole debate, is that. And I think you brought that up, and that's pretty good. Sorry, that's my non-proliferation soapbox from the EOD side.
No, it's okay. Look, you're 100% right. It's just a reality of the politics, the nature of what we live through right now, especially in the United States. We don't deep dive into stuff. We're not deep thinkers sometimes. It's unfortunate, and it's causing us to lose footprint on the international stage. Like I said, look, whether you like it or not, as I said last time we were talking to Mike, China was starving 40 years ago. They were eating whatever they could. It's hard to feed 2 billion people on the planet. So they finally made a decision, said, we're going to move forward, whether the world likes it or not. Now, they had a 100-year vision, a plan, 50-year plan, and none of it in that plan said U.S. number one. It said China number one, and China the lead, China the vision for the world. And for whatever reason, we had a hard time understanding that. I mean, look, you're in competition with other states, and the other states cannot defeat you from a military perspective, but they can defeat you however they want. In 3 weeks, they absolutely scuttled our economy, shattered it, and had our governors running around trying to, basically implement, Chinese methods of how to violate the Constitution of the United States. So we are individuals who have to have a better understanding that China is an adversary, and if you don't take them seriously, they're going to absolutely eat your lunch.
Now that's a good point you bring up. Actually, I want to do something. This is from an article by Sam Faddis, who has an interesting background for those that can look that up. So what he points out is that for the FRTIB, which is the retirement fund for all of it's the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, right, which is about $500-600 billion of funding, right, which comes from the military. It's our retirement fund. Federal service workers, it's their retirement fund. It's a lot of money, right? And so, as you said, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, China was basically on the ropes economically, right? And this is, you got guys like Gordon Chang that wrote about the coming collapse of China because they were looking at the numbers. But why didn't they collapse? Number one, the U.S. subsidized China to an amazing degree. Yep. I mean, you had these Kissinger zombies walking around, the Beltway talking about, China's great, just give them money and they're going to be like Coca-Cola swilling capitalists, in no time. And it didn't turn out. They turned into, like neo-fascist, neo-Nazis, basically. But feeding the beast, right? In other words, how do you support them is something that the U.S. has not even woken up to, even as of this year, even as of last year. So in November last year, and I'm going to read this out here real quick to you, and I want to get your comments on it because it does kind of move into the domestic political side. So again, for those that don't know, there's the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, and they have in total about $600 billion to play with, but they've got a number of smaller investments. But in this international fund, Mir, they've got $50 billion that they're looking to invest. And 3 years ago, they hitched their wagon to the horse of something called the MCSI index. And in that MCSI index, so in other words, the money from all of your military retirees that they're getting on, the money from all the federal employees, your FBI guys, your ATF guys, are going to some very bad actors in the CHICOM organization that support Iran, that support indirectly Hezbollah, and sometimes directly. So you've got Avic China Industry Technology. So Avic and its subsidiaries develop, aircraft. They've got drones, lots of weapons for the PLA, yes, the People's Liberation Army. They've been sanctioned by the U.S. for missile proliferation activities to Iran, right? And so they could get some of our dollars. Think about that for a moment. I mean, U.S. military is paying for weapons that could go to Iran that could be used against the U.S. in the Middle East. That blows my mind. China Industries Shipbuilding Group, CSIC, right? So that's the naval. That's your ground, guided missile destroyers, frigates, conventional submarines, aircraft carriers, some drones. This is the one that really gets me. It's Hickey Vision Digital Technology. So Hickey Vision, it's been all over the, if you're paying attention, it's been all over the news. These are the guys that use these social media systems and these electronic surveillance systems to kind of round up Uyghurs, to round up people that are enemies of the state within the CCP. So religious minorities, ethnic minorities, political minorities. So they round up these folks and then they put them in concentration camps, or they disappear them. They go for torture and worse. And that has been sanctioned by the U.S. government for human rights and other activities. And yet, U.S. military guys are going to be able to pay for that now, which is unconscionable. I mean, you're paying for concentration camps. Could you imagine this in the 1930s? And the list goes on and on. You've got ZTE, you've got the Quad C, China Unicom, Tribal Mobile, China Telecom Corporation, which is actively engaged in spying. I mean, this is some bad actors here. And what I want to know is, I'm going to point out the people that do it. I'm going to name and shame because that's, part and parcel of what I do. I just usually don't do it publicly. So the first guy in this thing was a guy named Kennedy. So who in the world is in charge of this thing, right? Who's the commander, so to speak? Who's the chairman of the fund? So this is the retirement fund, the FRTIB. So Kennedy. So this guy, basically what he's done is, and he resisted. So last year, there were some moves by, I believe it was the Congress or the Senate, that was looking at saying, hey, we don't need to be paying with $50 billion to put people in concentration camps. And Kennedy pushed back against that and said, to undo that now is a bad thing. And then, where did he get his information from? So Kennedy, who is with this, managing the portfolio of all of our retirement packages for the military, he looked over to this MSCI group, right? And so that's this other guy, Fernandez, right? And so I really want the audience to look up this guy, Fernandez. So if we get a little photo of that guy, he made a speech at the Foreign Policy Institute. So Fernandez, that guy, what he did was he doesn't even believe. So there's Fernandez right there, Foreign Policy Association. Go on YouTube, simply look at this video, listen about the 3-minute mark to what he says and how he says it, right? He says, I got my U.S. citizenship, but I'm a proud United States member of the world, right? So he's the United States of the world. So he literally disparages what's called the nation state, and which, it has its negatives, but it definitely also has its positives in this case. And so he wants to take money from the United States and kind of move it around the world. And that's his globalist vision. But the people he gives it to, especially in the CCP, are, again, this is a blood and soil nationalist. This is, as close as you could get to kind of, the Nazis of the 30s. That's what's going on in Beijing. Beijing and Berlin look an awful lot alike, different time zones. So these guys want to take all that money and be able to put it over there. And the only guy, and I do want to say, I want to put a positive spin a little bit on it. There's one guy there named Jason, and he was the only guy on the board of the FDRB, right? He's the one guy that stood up and said, you know what, this may be a bad idea. And this is what I like. This is the courage, right? This is the guy that can stand up against the tide. And he was an Obama appointee. This is not a partisan issue. In fact, I really like this because it's not a partisan issue, right? We got good people on all sides of the aisle here. And, as you said, we need to come together as Americans and as free people of the world, because there's a lot of allies in the world, and this guy, good for him. He was the only guy that stood up and said, let's just put this on the, let's kibosh this, let's table it for a little bit and look at how we can, shift this plan so we're not funding people in concentration camps, and missiles to Iran that'll be shooting our guys and that kind of stuff. But they voted him down. He was the only guy on that entire board that did it. And I definitely welcome people to look at, who are those guys and, where do they also go into? Because, if you look at for example, going back to Kennedy, Michael Kennedy, he's chairman, University of North Carolina, Harvard Business Club Atlanta, Atlanta Venture Forum Leadership Atlanta. He's a trustee at Phillips Exeter Academy. So this is the guy at your country club. This guy's taking the money and he wants to fund concentration camps. That's who this man is, because he didn't have the guts to go, you know what, let's just do the right thing. Instead, he's going to go for the easy way because he wants to make a big retirement package at, on our blood, sweat, and toil. So shame, Michael Kennedy. But I don't want to go down that road too far. But what in the world's going on with this bill that was produced last year? Is that going anywhere? What's happening with it?
Yeah, look, and it's sad too because you're talking about North Carolina, prestigious university, but at the same time, this is where I retired in North Carolina. Our Delta operators, Special Operations Forces, get trained in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, 82nd Airborne. Of course, they have no relationship with this individual, but he should understand more. Yeah, no, I mean, he should understand better that, this is not the
Yeah.
way to do it because as China gets stronger, we're going to have to fight against them in the long run. Hopefully, it's just in economics. But I think we could get to a point if we do our due diligence correctly, China will eat itself internally because they have a lot of problems too. Only 4% of their manufacturing base has still just come online. So they're hurting themselves. But
But how, I mean, how does that happen
it,
if we keep feeding them? How does it happen
well,
if we
look,
keep feeding them?
okay.
I mean, this is our federal
We
government.
keep
This
feeding
is
him.
United States retirement dollars. $50 billion from the United States military, basically, from the retirees, going to pay for the next war. The bullets that'll kill their kids
Look,
and their grandkids. What the heck?
let me kind of cover this, Bill, because I knew I was smiling when you mentioned it because I saw it also coming down the pike, and at least I looked at it when I was researching what I was looking at on my particular article. Sometimes when you're looking at different things, things pop up in front of you. You're like, what the heck? And the fact that I'm running for Congress right now, as I said, as a Republican in the a Republican nominee in the 9th Congressional District of Illinois, it was important for me to know what bills are out there. So in this case, what you were talking about is called S 2791, which was presented by U.S. Senator
Explain
Marco
that.
Rubio.
S two
Go
seven nine
ahead.
one. No, no, you said S two
Correct.
seven
So
nine one.
Mark, correct. That's a number for the bill. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
S2791. So it was presented by U.S. Senator Marco Rubio, in this case from Florida, as everybody knows him, and also Jeanne Shaheen, who is a Democrat from New Hampshire. So we're willing to work across the aisle. It was introduced in November. Both senators led a group of lawmakers, in this case, that introduced it. Is bipartisan bill, and also at the same time is bicameral, which means that this bill, in this case, if nobody knows what that means, it means that it that both chambers of Congress worked on it from the beginning. So that's a positive in itself. So we saw something coming that we decided, at least in Congress, to an extent, to work together. It was read twice last time I checked on it on the Senate floor. And once it's read on the Senate floor, it usually goes out for voting consideration or at the same time to be referred to a committee. Once it was read, the last time I saw it was, in this case, the bill was referred to the Committee for Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, and it was referred to on 6 November 20th. The committee is chaired by a Republican, Ron Johnson, who's from Wisconsin, and is called the Taxpayer and Saving Protection TSP Act. And we all know what the TSP is because we're in the military. I've actually used it when I was downrange my first time. And now, so this bill is supposed to prevent, as you were talking about, Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, the board you had mentioned, from steering federal retirement savings to China. Now, um, Senator Gillibrand, if I'm not mistaken, from New York, a Democrat, and Mitt Romney from Utah, also Senator from Missouri, and Rick Scott, from a Republican from Florida, and I think Senator Braun, also from Indiana, if I'm not mistaken, joined those Rubio and Shaheen in introducing the bill. And in this case, the U.S. representative, I know last time I checked, Mark Meadows from North Carolina, which is very important, as you mentioned. North Carolina should be and will be introducing, from what I was told, a complementing companion bill in the House. Our thrift saving plans, as you know, we work with a lot of Title 10 U.S. codes. Title 10, me and you have executed. Title 2022 has been executed by Mike. But Title 5 of the U.S. federal regulation governs this particular bill. But what's important is at least we're taking some legislative action forward. Now, the problem is if we stop infighting when it comes to Congress, which was one of the major leading factors as to how we came to be where we are today, where we didn't react as well as maybe we could have against the coronavirus. We'll get somewhere. But right now, as far as I know, that bill has been shelved. Why has been shelved? I'm not sure. Maybe they're waiting for Congress to come back after the coronavirus, and I'm hoping that when they come back and start starting an investigation and more House hearings on what was the reaction to the coronavirus, how we were supposed to handle it, maybe these type of bills can go through the process, and finally, at least we can remove our servicemen's pensions away from them. I mean, not only is China going to control our pensions, they control our manufacturing base, and then they also control the medicine that our service personnel need just to survive. Even their families, when they go to the commissaries or they go to, I should say not commissary, but post for their medical support and TRICARE. So I don't know. I mean, all I can tell you is that we need some folks in Congress to work together in order for us to be able to finally take the manufacturing base away from China and start, fighting him on this information operation on common battlefield.
Yep. Yeah. Looking at those missiles going to Iran just blew me away, literally. So, because we'll see them again, sadly, and we'll have paid for it, which is crazy. So, speaking of
Yep.
that, so I know Iran. I don't want to take up too much of your time on this one. I know you've got some other things to do, but I did want to drift a little bit more to the Middle East on that. Kind of the Iranian thing. I know there's a lot going on there that's not getting hit in the U.S. side news. In fact, a lot does get it in the U.S. news. But you've got it's near and dear to your heart. But I call it infotainment. It's not information. I've given up on U.S. news basically almost because it's infotainment. But I think it's important for some people to know what's going on still globally, especially in the Middle East, because we do still have a lot of interest in the Middle East, and there's still a lot going on over there that Americans need to be aware of. So actually, if you don't mind, I'll turn the microphone over to you and let you explain what's going on. Give a the nice 10,000 foot view, and then down to the 100 foot view about what's going on over there in the Middle East, in your neck of the woods.
Well, the Middle East hasn't changed in 6,000 years, so I'm not sure if any of the news I can give is going to change it. But they become more sophisticated in how they kill each other over the past 2,000 years. And as far as minorities are concerned, in this case, as I told you, the Syrians were stuck in a bad position. I think until we can get to a point where our State Department changes its perspective on how to deal with governments, we're never going to be able to win. Look, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China funnels a lot of support to Iran. There's a reason Iran has ballistic capabilities that it could park if it wants in the future, once it gets its hands on a nuke, in even my backyard, Skokie, Illinois. But everything's kind of related together. China, how it does it, it says to Iran, give me oil for free. Oil is cheap across the board. It's not making money for anybody for the next 5 years. And in this case, we're going to protect you on an international scale. What do? They work with their friends in the States to promote Iran as a legitimate government capability that we have to work with. They talk about how we need to remove sanctions on them as they're going through a coronavirus. All the money that we have that has in the past gone to them through even Europe for medical needs have been used for government of Iran to sustain its operations. And when it sustains operations, in this case in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and all over the place through its proxies, who is there with them is China. How's China there? Through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So they're the ones who actually give China a footprint in those regions. Iraq as being a main example for us is a state that barely is able to survive. Right now, Iraq's oil is worth nothing because oil is worth nothing across the board. Take a look at the major fight that's taking place with the Kurds in northern Iraq, who are supposedly our allies, who are going to make a deal with whoever they want to make, and for their benefit, not our benefit, and everybody else. I mean, right now we're fighting ISIS, guys. We're still fighting ISIS in northern Iraq. Why? Because the powers to be made the smart decision that, what we're going to do? We're going to take all the ISIS families, we're going to move them all into northern Iraq. And of course, somehow they figured that if they move the families, ISIS is not going to follow. Right now, in the disputed area that sits between the Iraqi Kurdish forces and the Iraqi army forces, ISIS is operating, and we're still having to use heavy capabilities to fight them. The problem is Iraqi North itself has issues. The Kurds are haven't paid their people because their major source of income was oil. In 2019, they made a deal with the Iraqi government that we're going to at least try to get 250 billion barrels of oil accounted to you guys so you could use it in order for us to be able to get a budget from you. So that oil was supposed to come to the Iraqi government so the Iraqi government could propose a budget for Iraqi Kurdish North. And obviously, the Kurds signed the agreement, but like everybody else in the Middle East, we're going to sign an agreement, but we're not going to follow through with it. So we believe in everything that is good about federalism. We want it, but we're going to break all the laws of federalism. We want everything from Iraq because it benefits us, but we're going to break all the laws. And corruption has been large in northern Iraq, especially amongst the Kurdish families that own really northern Iraq, in this case, the Barzanis and others. And even within the Kurdish groups, there's been major fighting right now. You're looking at Kurdistan being broken down into four particular locations. You're looking at Halabja, Sulaymaniyah, Erbil, and Duhok. These are the four major areas if you're looking at the map that the Kurds are internally fighting. You've had recently a lot of the Kurdish leaders, representatives from the various different groups and organizations come together and said, look, we don't want to be any longer part of this Kurdish regional government anymore because obviously we're not getting the money. Barzani, his family and clan is getting the dollars. And by the way, we don't have any leverage over Baghdad because as the Kurds sent a delegation to Baghdad and said, hey, we want to renegotiate this contract, Baghdad told them very simply, you broke a contract before. We can't even account for 250 billion barrels of oil. You went and signed contracts with oil companies and you're taking majority of that money and giving it to them anyway. So it's not our fault. Even though the Kurds said to them that we're going to give you everything possible, we're literally going to turn over the KRG to you, we're going to give you the airport, the border customs, anything else that we're supposed to be managing, which has led to this internal fight amongst the Kurds saying that then why are we all part of these specific promises tied to one KRG? Why don't we as an individual promise have our own KRG? So where you can see the Kurdish regional government in the north splitting amongst four different entities. And another thing, if you go to the historical aspect of how the Kurdish leaders have worked together in the past, they have signed a contract to make sure that, in this case, Jalal Taliban group does not fight against the Barzani group. But in the Ganjil Mountains, which I think there was a map that you brought up, in the Ganjil Mountain area where the PKK is, which is fighting the Kurds that are fighting against the Turks, although both of these two family sides from the Suleiman province, in this case, the Jalal Talabani and Erbil, which is mostly representative of Barzani, have said that we're never going to put our forces against each other. Guess what? They've sent forces into the Ganjil Mountains because they don't trust each other. So this is your biggest ally in the region now, which is supposedly the minorities, in the case of certain Christians, and the Yazidis and others, have to live under these individuals who cannot get along and are actually butchering each other after we made them multi-millionaires. I'm not going to even say billionaires yet, but multi-millionaires. And
Wow.
I don't see a fix because oil is no longer a viable revenue for them.
Hmm. So where do you see it going from here in the next year, 2 years? I mean, how does Iran take advantage of this? What is Turkey going to do in response to this? What is Iraq going to do in response to this? How do you see this playing out?
Well, they're going to do what they're doing. The regimes are going to try to survive. I think Iraq is going to put pressure on the Kurdish north. I think the Kurds either will have to learn to work because, look, when they decided to declare independence. How well did that go? When in less than 24 hours, the Iraqi military just moved right into the northern Iraq and said, "Good morning. We're here, and you're no longer a viable government." I think you're going to see a more of a degradation of the Kurdish regional government in the north. They're probably going to fight internally because it's just economics. The money isn't there. I hope we don't try to go bail them out as we did in the past, which would be a failure from the U.S. side. Because we continuously give money to Kurdish North to say that we've actually did something that worked, while we don't support any of the minorities. In this case, certain Christians have been butchered since 2003, from 1.5 million to 150,000 remaining. So I think if we can answer the minority issue, and I could talk about that next time we get a chance, on how to solve the minority issue in Iraq, you'll see a much better capability between the Kurds and the Iraqis working together. But Iran's still continuing on this path. As long as the Chinese and the SCO are willing to support it, it's going to be very difficult. Look, even Israel itself is having problems, and we rarely come to the support of our ally. And I would say the only ally we have in the Middle East. Israel's Supreme Court just recently said to Netanyahu that the agreement that was made as far as the sharing of the power in the government is no longer viable by the read that they had, and now they have to go through elections again. So you can't continuously go through these elections and think that your security timeline is not being pushed back. You're constantly shifting it to the right, as we say in the military, and that's not good for us. There's a lot of pieces that have to be finally settled, and now we don't know where this COVID piece is going to lead the elections for us. And depending if President Trump wins and comes back in office or not, there's going to be a lot of chaos, a lot of open sores that have to be addressed. I do know one thing, is that we have an opportunity to set China back off of their 50-year plan, 50 years, okay, or off of their 100-year plan, 50 years. And I highly would encourage the people who care about America to understand that you're never going to defeat the Chinese Communist Party. They're not going to be defeated, but you could pull their teeth out. And I think once you pull their teeth out, it's much better for us to be able to operate with them and leverage with them than it is today. They say they have all these great scientists that have been able to provide information for us as far as the coronavirus, and possibly even they have the manufacturing base that we have to go back to when it comes to just manufacturing the serums and the antidotes and anything that we need in order to help us immune our folks here. Well, if that's the case, then bring them over here, put them in our labs. And then, as you mentioned, Taiwan only had 6 deaths. We'll bring the Taiwan leadership down here, bring their doctors here, and put them in charge of those Chinese. And say, okay, guys, you can work our labs, and we'll support you. If they truly care about helping America, if they only care about themselves internally, and their main issue is to see how much they could bleed the U.S., like I said, it costs a lot of money to feed 2 billion people. Then we have to make the tough call, and at the end make the decision that we need to move our manufacturing bases here, especially for PPEs and all other requirements that we have, and start working with other global partners that are like us, like-minded, in order to finally check the Chinese Communist government and let their people deal with them internally.
Nope, that's pretty good. Now, if people want more information about your organization, and you're also running for Congress, or you in the 9th Congressional District in Chicago. So if people want more information on that to kind of check it out, make contact with you, how do they do that?
Well, they could go to the Near East Center for Strategic Engagement. Thanks again. I was on you were talking to you and Mike a couple of weeks ago, and don't talk about the
Remember,
Chinese.
not my show. I'm just Joan Rivers. He's the Johnny Carson. I'm just Joan
Yeah,
Rivers. That's
the servers may not work too well, but we're back up and operational. Always have a backup plan. So the nec-se.com is up and operational, and we also have a backup necSC.net And also at the same time, I'm running Vote Singari is my site, and it's going to be a compressed type of a election time. It's very hard running against an incumbent who's got $2.3 million in their coffers, and nobody even knows you exist to an extent as you're running against them, because you can't even go out and meet folks. Because if you go to somebody's door right now and knock on it, you're like a weapon system. Everybody's afraid of catching the virus, and it's difficult. We had 4 officers in Chicago who caught it that I know of. We work with the Legion of St. Michael, and I'm a member of the Legion of St. Michael law enforcement community, and I've had family members, 2 specifically very close, that have caught it. It's hard, but whatever we had for fundraising that we had set up, we had to cancel all those events. But if people want to help, the best way is to go to Vote Singari, and any donation helps. And we'll try to run this campaign on social media as much as possible, that we have an opportunity to get out there and meet voters, hopefully.
Well, I think that's probably going to be a big issue here in the next, probably few weeks. Is how do you continue a democracy under a quarantine? How do you do a cyber democracy? So I think there's a lot of issues on that. I know there's a lot of debate going on about when our organizational structure has been participatory democracy with a lot of meeting and networking and that kind of thing in person. Can it transition with enough safeguards in there that there's not fraud and abuse? To something that's automatic, that's remote, and that sort of thing. So I think. A good deep discussion. I don't know if you want to come back on that, but that would be fascinating to talk about. How do you do, a legitimate election in a remote situation, right? How do you do those safeguards, and then how do you campaign? How do you meet voters? How do you interact with voters? Because there's a lot of materials that we're using. I mean, we're doing it right now, with the cyber connectivity. But how do you make sure that you've safeguarded that so that it cannot be there's not fraud and abuse that can be crept into it. So, I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think it'll advance a lot further. But, it's interesting, those questions about how do we go from here, and what's that election going to look like? So if you're up to it, we'll definitely like to have you back, and then, we can talk about those issues. And I would like to know about Chicago, the first responders, the next time you come back, how they're doing on stress, how they're doing, handling up to this thing. Cause I know the workload's probably tough on them. I know the family life's probably tough on them, and it's kind of a marathon now.
Extremely tough.
About a month into it now, and so their op tempo has been fairly high, and now people are getting a little stir crazy. So there's some I'm listening to the scanners and listening to the frequencies, and there's a lot of crazy calls going on. These guys are getting stressed, and so I'd be very interested in how Chicago is responding to that, and what kind of support networks they've got for their folks that are out there in the front lines, and the police and the medical services, to make sure that they can maintain and sustain and keep going. They're taking care of in their mental health issues. I'd be very interested in that. So if you're up for it, we'd love to have you back. All right, appreciate it. Anything else you want to say before we turn it out here?
Mike, for you and Mike, anytime. Always supporting our Army buddies. But keep on doing the great work you're doing, Al. Is guys like you and Mike on the front lines of this fight, that are really kind of broadening the people's perspective, and it's great to have you guys out there doing the yeoman's work that you are. And if I can contribute in any which way, let me know.
Well, we appreciate your knowledge, and always happy to have you here. So thank you very much. And then thanks to Freddie down in LA, the silent guy behind the screen here. So very, very happy to have him. He actually, he sort of made me look a little bit good here. So that's nice. So thank you again. And to everybody, stay tuned for this one. We thank you very much. We'll try to do this a week, just kind of coffee with Al as Mike prepares for the next journey in his investigative endeavors. So thank you very much, and you guys have a good day. And remember, every day you're vertical at the end of the day, it's a good day. Have a good night.
This is it. This is storming the castle. Some drama's going on down here. We need the oil. Look at the squeaking.